Chicagoland weather forecast. From the 1 Hour Heating and Air Conditioning Weather Center, more clouds than sun today. Warm and humid, high 84. Currently 73 degrees. Your next news update is at 9. Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
This hourly segment is brought to you by the Money Hour radio show, Saturday afternoons at 3 on AM 560, The Answer. Brought to you by Pearshell Financial Group.
See Michelle Malkin, Sean Hannity, and Laura Logan at Freedom Summit 2019. Tickets on sale now at freedomsummitchicago.com.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. We have a few geopolitical matters to address before we allow you to scamper off to your weekend festivities. One of them is this news that broke yesterday. Perhaps sort of the next scandal in waiting. Perhaps not. We don't know a lot. Washington Post reporting a whistleblower complaint filed with the Inspector General in the intelligence community that suggests, per this whistleblower, that President Trump made some untoward statement or untoward offer, maybe illegal offer.
Or some type of a promise.
We don't know. Ostensibly to the newly installed president of Ukraine. This follows a House Intelligence Committee investigation to whether or not the Trump administration, one of their many investigations, whether or not the Trump administration tried to pressure the newly installed Ukrainian president to provide information as to Vice President Joe Biden's activity in Ukraine while he was vice president on behalf of his son Hunter, who had an interest in an energy company in the Ukraine that was run by some Ukrainian plutocrat. And here was the reaction. I thought this was the most interesting reaction. The reaction from President Trump: this is fake news. I didn't do anything wrong. I know people listening on the calls, including our people, for making informed intelligence estimates. And so I would never say anything reckless or inappropriate on a call where I know there are other parties, both our people and their people, whoever they are that I'm speaking of or speaking to. So you know what you're going to get from Trump. You know what you're going to get from Adam Schiff, chair of House Intel. But Philip Mudd, who is a veteran of the CIA and a CNN counterterrorism analyst, his exchange with Fredo Cuomo on CNN, I thought, was informative.
Boy, I'm about ready to blow a gasket. Can you explain? That is extremely unusual. And I listened to presidential phone calls when I was an official at the White House under George W. Bush in 2001. Can you explain to me, A, why it's the U.S. intelligence community's responsibility to listen to the president of the United States speaking to a foreign leader, and B, why the U.S. intelligence community, under the rules provided by the Democrats in Congress, are responsible to report to the Congress what the president of the United States says? Last I checked, Chris, when I served, we're responsible for chasing the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and terrorists. We're not responsible for reporting to the Congress what the president says. He can say what he wants, Chris.
So you don't like that somebody snitched on the president?
Correct. The question, if you have a whistleblower issue in the intelligence community, might be, is somebody misusing funds? For example, is somebody seeing something about covert action overseas, that is CIA operations overseas, that's inappropriate? For example, when I was in the business, we ran black sites, secret facilities. Mm-hmm. Did somebody see something that was not only unethical and immoral, but
in-house
illegal?
Policing.
Correct.
All right. So
not what does the president say?
All right, but now hold on a second. Well, what if he did say something to a foreign leader that sounded like a promise that went over the line enough that somebody of good conscience said he's not supposed to say things like this?
Well, pardon me, what the heck is over the line? The president can say what he wants to Putin. He can say what he wants to Kim Jong-un. He can say to Kim Jong-un, which I think is completely over the top, I'm going to go meet you in the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, despite the fact that we don't have any real agreements, as far as I can tell, on nukes and missiles. The president can say what he wants. It's not the responsibility of the intel guys to go police the president and go snitch on him to the Congress.
For more on this topic, as well as the continuing tension between the Saudis and the Iranians, all in the context of an Israeli prime ministerial election. We're pleased to be joined by David Hendrickson, who teaches international politics and American foreign policy in the political science department at Colorado College. He's also the author of the book Republican Peril, American Empire and the Liberal Tradition. Professor, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
What's your reaction to not just what Phil Mudd had to say, but to this whistleblower lawsuit and the coverage of it? Whistleblower complaint and the coverage of it, I should say.
Well, I wish I knew. I actually have not. I just saw that headline this morning.
Okay.
And I don't think it's a big deal based on what I've known. I think the much bigger deal is the impending war with Iran, which I think probably is about 1,000 times more important.
Well, let's talk about that then. I mean, Lindsey Graham is doing his best Mark Antony impersonation, crying havoc and wanting to let slip the dogs of war. Is Lindsey Graham right?
Well, he's flirting with some very serious dangers because we've gotten ourselves into a situation in which the United States, over the past year, has effectively declared war against Iran. People don't realize that, but we've tried to asphyxiate it. You know, we're trying to cut its oil exports to zero, and Iran has historically depended for its revenues, its export earnings on oil. That's 80% of it. So we're trying to, as I say, deprive it of oxygen, and under those circumstances, we're going to get pushback from them. And so escalation under those circumstances will lead to further escalation by Iran. And, that puts the president's re-election in peril, and it puts our economy and a lot of things in peril if we start trading, I'll blow up your oil refinery and you can blow up ours, and we'll see how that affects the world supply of oil.
Next thing you know, they'll be blowing up our water supplies or the water reclamation plant here in Chicago.
Well, I don't think it's going to go that far, but we have to focus on the fact that, they used to have, 2 or 3 million barrels of oil a day for export. Now they're down to about 100,000. And that's a huge change. And so, the Iranians are in a very tight spot in which if they just can't go with the status quo. And
But isn't that the point of sanctions? The point of sanctions is to impose consequences on bad actors to get them to change their bad actions, and it's working. So why should we let any pressure off?
Well, I don't see that it's working at all. How is it working?
Well, I mean, in terms of exactly what you just said, it's pushing the Iranians into more dramatic action because they're suffering under the weight of those sanctions. Why should we engage? Why should we allow them any relief from that?
Well, the purpose of it was to get a new nuclear agreement. We haven't gotten that. We're very far away from it, further away than we were when we had the agreement, because the Iranians are now going to probably slip out of it. And so the objective was to get a new nuclear agreement. They're very far distant at this point. And, the demands that we put on the Iranians were basically that they stop having a foreign policy and obey us. Well, those sorts of demands only kind of get fulfilled at the end of a successful war. We're not there. And I think that if we do have a war, it's likely to be unsuccessful, in the sense of forcing them to kowtow to what we're demanding.
Well,
go ahead.
Let me ask you this, though. I mean, the goal, as you say, a new nuclear agreement, was that the right goal in the first place? Because a new nuclear agreement with Iran, sort of like a trade agreement with the Chinese, it's not worth the paper it's written on.
Well, I don't think that's true. I mean, the Iranians adhered to the agreement that Obama reached with them. Trump didn't charge. There really wasn't a violation. I mean, all the people who looked at it said that they were adhering to it. The Trump people just said it's not a good agreement. And I think it was a good agreement. It was the best that we could get under the circumstances, and the alternative was something like the situation that we're now in, and where we're trying to deprive them not only of a nuclear weapon, but even the capability of building one theoretically. No scientists, no enrichment of any kind. And, the Iranians have rights under the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. And so we're saying, no, you can't have those. And that's a very extreme demand, and, it produces this sort of confrontation.
So what is the approach that we should be taking then?
I think we should go back to the Iran agreement that Obama negotiated and give up on this oil embargo. I don't see that the end road as leading to anything other than something that's actually very dangerous for our interest, the world's interest. Oil is the lifeline. And if you have a tit-for-tat war between Iran and the United States, trying to determine who can destroy the most in the way of oil facilities, you could have an economic crisis of huge dimensions.
Well, that economic crisis, the threat of that has been reduced greatly over the last couple of decades thanks to LNG and new oil deposits that we found here, where America is much more energy independent. In fact, we're the largest oil producer in the world now than it was back in the day. So, I mean, the threat of Iran blowing up Saudi oil fields just doesn't have the same impact as it once did.
Well, no. I mean, if you cut 5 million barrels a day from world production, you get an oil price of, $300 a barrel, something like that.
Yeah.
Maybe more. Over time, you can make up with that kind of loss, but in an immediate crisis, you can't.
What about letting this?
So, I mean, that would be really great for people in Texas, but I'm telling you, people in Chicago who are looking at paying $8 for gas wouldn't think the same way, and it would still produce a recession. I mean, it would produce a recession throughout the world. These oil shocks always do that. And we're not as vulnerable as a country to that as we once were, because we, as you say, we've become a big oil producer. But you're still it would still be a gigantic mess if you got a price explosion as a result of the tit-for-tat war.
The politicians in Chicago will get us to $8 a gallon here before the Saudis do. Let me guarantee you that, Professor.
Okay, then how about 12 after they put all their taxes on it?
So what about the suggestion that has been made in some policy circles as well as by some Republican polls that basically greenlight the Saudis to strike back at the Iranians if they're so convinced that the Iranians, through the Houthis, leveled those strikes against the Saudi oil fields? Let it be a Saudi versus Iran bipolar conflict in the region.
Well, you'd still get that result that I'm talking about, which is a tit-for-tat war over these oil facilities. And I don't think that the Saudis, I really don't think it matters all that much. They're, our dependent. So it would be very difficult for the United States to just turn aside and say, oh, well, they're having a big war over there in which they're blowing up all this oil stuff. So,
well, what about economic sanctions on Iran? Is that making a dent at all?
Well, we've already, it's making a huge dent. I mean, that's put us in this situation in which, they're desperate because they don't have oil exports and they want to get those lifted.
How do you navigate the relationship with Netanyahu, or if it's not Netanyahu, whoever the next prime minister of Israel is, with respect to our joint commitment to oppose that Obama nuclear deal, which both Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump believed was a glide path to a nuclear Iran?
Well, Gantz is in favor of that agreement. So,
but he's not going to be the prime
I don't
minister.
think anyone can really predict how this Israeli, the formation of the government there is going to go. They're kind of in this bind where it's very difficult to see how they can put together any kind of governing coalition because, all the parties have these non-negotiable demands.
Right.
So I don't know how that's going to turn out. But it is interesting that the alternative to Netanyahu has a more favorable attitude towards that agreement. So if he becomes PM, that could change the dynamic in certain ways, because that Israeli demand that, we get out of the nuclear agreement has been an important factor in the U.S. attitude.
Speaking
So
of
that could be significant.
Speaking of Israel and Iranian compliance with the terms of the Obama deal, didn't Israeli intelligence uncover a cache of information from the Iranians that suggested that they were continuing their nuclear program, that they were not complying with the agreement, and that this was exactly what it was predicted to be, which was a glide path to a nuclear Iran? Didn't Bibi go public with a bunch of information to that effect?
Yeah, but the intelligence that they got related to things that the Iranians did 15 years ago, and so I don't think it shows a lack of compliance with the existing agreement as of 6 months ago or something like that. I mean, the Israelis, have said this, that the Iranians aren't complying, but a lot of other people said that they were, and I think that the UN inspectors who've gone in and looked at it have provided pretty good evidence that they were within the terms of the agreement.
I don't know. My default position is to be more trusting of our allies than our enemies. And I would, I mean, that's me.
Yeah, that's fine. But I'm just saying, we have an alternative, which is to go to war with Iran or to try to make peace with it in some way. So take your pick. We can easily go to war with them. That's the easiest thing in the world to do. It's just the difficult thing is figuring out a way to win it.
Well, yeah.
And, you tell me what the war plan is that wins it.
Well, yeah, I don't know that that necessarily sort of the formal declarations of war and bombings and troop deployments and those sorts of things. And I'm not sure that Iran has the capacity to inflict as much damage as you're suggesting. I mean, the Strait of Hormuz and the burning of Saudi oil fields, doesn't present an existential threat to me.
Well, how much oil does the world economy lose as a result of that? That's the big question. And, it is true that back in the 80s, you had a big war in the Gulf, and the Iraqis bombed the heck out of Karg Island, where the Iranians export their oil, and the Iranians managed to keep it up. So, you could imagine refineries and such getting blown up, and that not dramatically affecting oil exports. I mean, that is what happened in the 80s. But, you also have a new class of weapons now that are a lot more accurate. And as in this recent attack, the Iranians targeted, I'm assuming that they were the ones that did it, they targeted these critical nodes within the Saudi refineries. And so no one really knows how that would go, but I don't want to find out, because I think that it could, you're talking about some very serious risks, and we would be affected by it. If you got a loss of 5 million barrels a day from the Gulf, as I say, you're going to get an oil shock big time, in which the price would go up double, more.
I'm sorry.
That's a big deal.
He is Professor David Hendrickson, teaches international politics, American foreign policy in the political science department at Colorado College. Also, the book,